By the middle of the 1970s, a Connecticut rifle company that most casual gun owners today would struggle to name was quietly outselling Winchester, the single most recognizable name in the entire history of American lever-action rifles, a genuine commercial reversal that happened almost entirely outside public attention. That company had already survived more than a century in business, built one of the most popular hunting rifles ever manufactured in the United States, and helped arm American forces in two separate world wars fought a generation apart. Almost nobody outside serious hunting and collecting circles remembers any of it today. This is the story of Marlin Firearms, the rifle company that quietly outcompeted America's most famous gunmaker for decades, survived two separate corporate collapses under two entirely different owners, and still remains, to most of the country, the most forgotten major name in American gun-making history. Every week, we take apart the story stamped on the receiver of an American firearm, the founders, the factories, and the decisions that built a legend or lost one. Subscribe if that is the kind of history you want more of. Before lever-action rifles ever became the company's own defining product, Marlin's earliest years in business focused on a considerably less glamorous category of firearm entirely. John Marlin began his own working life as a machinist and toolmaker, and his first commercial firearms were small, affordable pocket revolvers aimed at ordinary buyers who wanted personal protection without the expense of a full-sized Colt or Smith & Wesson product. A modest, practical business that gave Marlin the manufacturing experience and working capital he would eventually need to attempt something considerably more ambitious against the entrenched lever-action rifle market Winchester had already claimed for itself. John Malin Marlin founded his own company in New Haven, Connecticut in 1870, entering a lever-action rifle market that Winchester had already dominated for years by that point and that offered little obvious room for a new competitor without some genuine mechanical advantage of its own to offer hunters and shooters. Marlin's early model 1881 became the first commercially successful large-bore lever-action rifle capable of handling serious hunting cartridges like the .38-55 and the .45-70, establishing the company as a genuine, rather than merely nominal competitor to Winchester's own established product line and giving hunters an actual alternative for the first time in years. The real turning point came in 1889 when Marlin introduced a solid top receiver with side ejection, a design that made the rifle structurally stronger than Winchester's own open-top competitors, and almost as an afterthought at the time, left a clear, unobstructed line directly above the receiver where a telescopic sight could actually be mounted, a feature Winchester's own competing designs could not easily match without a considerably more invasive redesign of their own. That advantage seemed relatively minor when telescopic sights themselves remained a rare, expensive accessory limited mostly to serious target shooters and a handful of wealthy hunters, but it grew steadily more valuable across the following decades as optics became cheaper, more reliable, and eventually close to standard equipment on any serious hunting rifle, a slow-moving market shift that rewarded Marlin's own 19th century engineering decision decades after the fact, in a way its own original designers could not possibly have fully anticipated when they first drew up the solid top receiver. That side ejection layout became Marlin's own defining mechanical signature, carried forward through the Model 1893, the Model 1894, and eventually the rifle that would define the company for the rest of the 20th century and well into the next one. Before we get into how that single mechanical decision actually played out in the marketplace over the following century, if you are finding this useful, hit subscribe. It costs nothing, and it helps the channel keep telling these stories. The 3030 cartridge itself deserves its own share of credit for the Model 336's eventual commercial dominance, a round that became, over the following decades, the single most widely used deer hunting cartridge in the entire history of American hunting, chambered in rifles from multiple manufacturers, but forever associated in the minds of generations of hunters with the specific lever-action rifles, Marlin's own Model 336 Chief among them, that carried it into the woods each autumn. Marlin's own advertising through the middle decades of the 20th century leaned directly into that association, positioning the rifle less as a piece of sporting equipment competing on any single technical specification and more as a genuinely trusted companion for exactly the kind of ordinary, unglamorous deer season hunting that defined the actual experience of millions of American gun owners far more than any single dramatic feature ever could. Marlin's own manufacturing capability proved just as valuable to the United States government as it had already proven to ordinary American hunters shopping for a reliable deer rifle. During the First World War, Marlin became one of the largest machine gun producers in the entire world, manufacturing the M1895 Colt Browning machine gun and a specialized variant, informally known simply as the Marlin gun, adapted specifically for mounting on American and Allied aircraft, work that placed the company at the center of exactly the kind of large-scale wartime production this channel has already documented, with several other American manufacturers navigating the same sudden wartime demand for weapons at a scale peacetime contracts had never required of them. John Marlin himself did not live to see the company's later 20th century success. Frank Kenna purchased the company at auction in 1924. And the Kenna family went on to own and operate Marlin for more than 8 decades afterward, steadily refining the same side-ejection, lever-action platform through one popular model after another, rather than chasing dramatic new designs, including the Model 1891, the first lever-action rifle ever chambered specifically for the .22 long rifle cartridge, a design that eventually evolved into the beloved Model 39A, a rimfire rifle generations of American hunters and target shooters learned to shoot on long before they ever graduated to anything more powerful. Marlin's own product catalog extended well beyond lever-action rifles alone, a breadth of manufacturing that further reinforces exactly how thoroughly the company's own reputation ended up outpacing its public name recognition. The Marlin Model 60, a semi-automatic .22 long rifle introduced in the 1960s, went on to sell in numbers reaching well into the millions, becoming one of the single best-selling rimfire rifles ever produced by any American manufacturer, and a genuine rite of passage rifle for entire generations of young shooters learning the basics of marksmanship on a family farm or at a local range long before they ever picked up anything more powerful. Marlin also acquired the Harrington and Richardson Company, generally known simply as H&R, in the year 2000, adding a well-established maker of break-action shotguns and rifles to its own portfolio, and briefly expanding Marlin's own manufacturing footprint. Even as the broader lever-action rifle market, the company had built its original reputation on continued shrinking as a share of the overall American hunting rifle industry. The Kenna family's own approach to running Marlin across those 8 decades reflected a deliberately conservative business philosophy that, whatever its cost in public excitement, proved remarkably durable in practice. Rather than chasing dramatic new product categories or aggressive expansion into unrelated markets the way some competing manufacturers periodically attempted, successive generations of Kenna family leadership focused specifically on incremental refinement of the same core lever-action and rimfire product lines, trusting that steady quality and consistent availability would matter more to Marlin's own core hunting customer base than novelty for its own sake. That patient, almost stubbornly unglamorous management style meant Marlin rarely generated the kind of dramatic press coverage a flashier competitor's product launch might attract, but it also meant the company avoided many of the overextension and debt problems that eventually claimed several of its own less disciplined competitors across the same stretch of the 20th century. The Model 336, introduced in 1948 and incorporating patents developed by Marlin's own engineer Thomas Robinson Jr., working alongside fellow Marlin employee L.L. Hepburn, became the company's single most significant commercial achievement, a lever-action rifle chambered primarily in .30-30 Winchester that went on to sell more than 4 million examples across a production run that has continued, with only a brief interruption during the Remington bankruptcy years, all the way into the present day, making it one of the most produced hunting rifles in the entire history of American firearms manufacturing, regardless of category or manufacturer. By the middle of the 1970s, that steady, unglamorous commercial success had quietly overtaken Marlin's own much more famous rival entirely, Marlin's own lever-action sales actually surpassing Winchester's for the first time in the two companies' long parallel history, stretching back more than a century, a genuine underdog milestone that received nowhere near the public attention a comparable Winchester achievement would almost certainly have generated in the trade press of the era. Buried instead in sales figures, few casual hunters or collectors ever thought to actually compare directly against each other. Marlin's own long, stable family ownership finally ended in December of 2007, when the Kenna family sold the company to Remington Arms, itself owned at the time by Cerberus Capital Management's Freedom Group, the exact same private equity conglomerate. This channel has already documented running Remington itself into the ground through the same basic pattern of accumulated debt, cost-cutting, and factory relocation that had already proven so damaging to that separate, older company. The acquisition made a certain financial logic on paper, consolidating two historic American gunmakers under a single corporate umbrella with the promised efficiencies of shared manufacturing, distribution, and administrative overhead. But the actual result played out considerably less smoothly than the original deal's own investment thesis had presumably projected. Marlin production moved away from its historic Connecticut home to facilities in Kentucky and New York, and quality control suffered noticeably enough by the accounts of longtime Marlin owners and collectors who had spent decades trusting the same New Haven fit and finish that the company earned itself the unflattering nickname Remlin among frustrated customers who no longer recognized the workmanship they had come to expect from the original factory. Remington's own repeated bankruptcies, the first in 2018 and a final terminal filing in July of 2020, dragged Marlin down alongside it. The storied brand's own production effectively halted while its parent company's assets were broken apart and sold off piece by piece to whichever buyers actually wanted them. Marlin's own considerable historical reputation counting for remarkably little in the actual bankruptcy proceedings themselves. Marlin's rescue came, once again, from an established rival, rather than any dramatic act of independent revival led by the company's own management, a pattern this channel has already documented, playing out at Savage Arms under remarkably similar circumstances a few years apart. In September of 2020, Sturm, Ruger & Company purchased Marlin's intellectual property, inventory, and physical assets for roughly $30 million out of the wreckage of Remington's own final bankruptcy proceedings, pledging to restore the brand's own manufacturing standards through modern computer-controlled machining and considerably stricter quality oversight than the Remington years had ever provided its own customers. Ruger's own decision to preserve the Marlin name rather than simply absorb its designs into Ruger's own existing product catalog reflected a calculated bet that the brand itself, despite more than a decade of declining quality under Remington's ownership, still carried enough residual goodwill among serious hunters and collectors to be worth reviving as a distinct, separately marketed line rather than quietly folding into Ruger's own broader identity. The first genuinely Ruger-built Marlin rifle, a Model 1895 variant, reached customers in 2021 to broadly positive reviews from a collector and hunting community that had spent more than a decade watching a once trusted name slowly lose its own reputation under absentee corporate ownership, more interested in balance sheets than actual rifles. Collectors today still sort surviving Marlin rifles by a simple proof-mark shorthand passed down through online forums and gun shows alike. JM stamp barrels indicate the original pre-Remington era production. Most serious buyers still consider the gold standard. REP stamped examples mark the Remington years, worth inspecting considerably more carefully before any purchase changes hands. This is not a story about a company that failed to compete, since Marlin's own side-ejection design and steady commercial execution genuinely outperformed its most famous rival for years at a stretch. Few people ever noticed happening in real time, let alone remembered afterward once the moment had passed into the ordinary background noise of an industry nobody outside it was paying particularly close attention to. It is a story about how thoroughly a company can succeed in the marketplace while still losing the wider battle for public recognition entirely. a rifle maker that helped arm two world wars a generation apart, quietly outsold Winchester through an entire decade of the 1970s, survived being absorbed by the exact same private equity structure that simultaneously destroyed a much older and more famous rival company, and still remains in the popular imagination a distant second thought behind rivals whose own reputations, whatever their genuine merits, were simply built and defended more loudly across generations of advertising, film appearances, and folklore. Marlin's own quieter, more workmanlike reputation never quite managed to match, despite arguably deserving just as much of it. Today, Marlin rifles built under Ruger's own renewed ownership continue rolling off the same basic side-ejection design John Marlin's engineers first perfected back in 1889, a lever-action platform old enough to have armed hunters through 6 separate American generations and resilient enough to have survived a private equity collapse that permanently destroyed the parent company that once owned it alongside it. The same JM Proofmark collectors now search for on decades-old barrels once meant nothing more than an ordinary factory stamp on an ordinary working rifle, and now represents to the shooters who still seek it out specifically at gun shows and estate sales across the country, the clearest surviving evidence of exactly how good an unglamorous, unfamous American gunmaker could actually be when nobody outside its own devoted customer base was paying particularly close attention to what the company was actually accomplishing decade after decade. If you want more stories about the companies that quietly won the argument and still lost the recognition, subscribe, and we will keep finding them. See you in the next one.